Hi, my name is Karen Fabian, and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and I want to welcome you back to the Bare Bones Yoga Learn Yoga Challenge. This is a free video series, a training on how to do yoga, and if you've been following along from the beginning, that's awesome. If you haven't, I want you to go back and watch videos 1 through 4 and then jump into this one, number 5. I'm not going to go into a lot of the background of kind of the rationale behind offering up this challenge, but if you're just jumping in, go back not only to video number 1, but to the introduction and listen to my reasoning around why I'm even doing this, because it really will kind of inform your then following on and absorbing the rest of the content. So I want to start out by letting you know about some of the folks who have won my Structure and Spirit book. I mentioned in the first couple of videos that for every person that comments on the video, you'll be entered to a random drawing for a copy of my latest book, Structure and Spirit, which is an examination of both the anatomy and the spiritual side of yoga practice. So I'm going to contact these folks, but I want to just call them out. And if you're watching this video, please send me an email, Karen@barebonesyoga.com, to claim your prize. So the first person is Jen M. She's from video number 1. Video number 2, Kelly Dowd. Video number 3 is Monique. And so any of those 3 folks, or all of them, please give me an email and we'll get your mailing address and send you a copy of the book. So today I want to talk about balancing poses. So here we are at video number 5. We've gone through several of the individual postures that are primarily standing poses. And now we're going to focus on balances. We're going to look at eagle, tree, half moon, and crow. So let's kind of dive right in. Let me start out by saying that balancing poses can bring up a lot of different feelings in our students. And if you're watching this and you're a teacher, you may notice that people kind of fidget when they're in balancing poses. There's a bit of a struggle there. And I remember one of my private students said something to me that really was so profound. She said that after several years of practicing yoga and really getting frustrated with balancing postures, she realized that finding balance wasn't a matter of being perfectly still. It was really more about finding peace within this kind of dynamic movement. And while she said she did find some moments of stillness, it was really more trying to find her center, and that actually was a little bit of an active dynamic process. And I thought that was so interesting and such a really kind of mature way to look. You know, when we head into balances, if we're looking for perfection, if we're looking for complete stillness, just think about it on a muscular level, an anatomical level, we can really set our expectations so high that anything less than that in our perception can be a disappointment. Rather than going into it and really just looking for the center. And that really, again, this is where the metaphors, you can really kind of pile them on. So finding our center is both a physical piece, but it's also a mental piece. How can we set our gaze? How can we be in the moment? How can we be present? And then anatomically, how can we physically find our center in all the different balancing shapes? So just kind of keeping that in mind, and if you are watching this and you're a teacher, finding ways to weave that theme into this particular part of the sequence. So let's first take a look at the first posture, and I'm referencing here the PDF that you should have to follow along with as you watch the videos, and I'll include the link to the PDF if you don't have it here, don't have it yourself. So eagle pose is the first one. And for eagle pose, let's take a look at first the upper body. So the upper body positioning looks something like, on the right side, this, bringing the right arm under the left. And so you'll notice if you look at it from the front, I'm not hunched over. I'm not kind of sleepy and letting the hands flop. It's a very energized shape. And if you look at it from the side, the shoulders and the elbows are pretty much in line. And if you look at it from the back, you'll notice my shoulder blades are pretty flat on my back, but they're somewhat moved apart versus like that. And so one of the muscles that we're calling on in terms of the shoulders is the serratus anterior. And I mentioned this muscle, if you think back, another video where I mentioned the serratus anterior as a shoulder stabilizer was what pose? It was low push-up. And this is the kind of counter muscle to the shoulder blade elevator, which lives here on the back of the body, right? So if it's going to elevate the shoulder blades, it's probably going to attach somewhere to the shoulder blade, obviously, the upper part. And so we're talking about the trapezius, the upper trapezius. And so if I engage the trapezius, I lift the shoulder blades up. Because the serratus lives here from the medial aspect of the, let's see, the ribs to the shoulder blades themselves. I was thinking rhomboid, but serratus is ribs to shoulder blades themselves. It hugs the shoulder blades more onto the back. So it keeps the shoulder blades kind of drawn closely to the body. So other than the rhomboids, which attach the medial aspect of the scapula to the thoracic vertebra here, which would, if they were engaged, draw the shoulder blades closer together. The serratus keeps the shoulder blade flat on the back versus letting the trapezius elevate. So as we come into eagle pose, in terms of the upper body, we want to keep the shoulders and the elbows about the same height. And we want to have some action through the hands. You know, if you think of the name of the pose, eagle, you know, I kind of think these are like the wings. Now, in terms of the lower body, we're wrapping one leg around the other. So on the right side, it's right arm under, right leg over. And this is a great way, if you think about, to squeeze the thighs together. We're engaging the adductor muscles that live on the interior aspect, the midline or the median of the thigh, the femur bone. If I wrap the thighs, I contract those muscles, and as a result, I lengthen the muscles on the outer hips. So here we're talking about our external rotators, so muscles like the piriformis, for instance, okay? Now, one little side note, sometimes you'll see, and I'm also flexing the hips, sometimes you'll see people double wrap, meaning they take the foot under and around. And you can see when I do that, it pulls my right hip forward. So I lose that centering aspect. The other thing it does is it can put some pressure on the inner and outer knee, because now as I wrap the foot around, the tension around the knee itself increases, and the strain on those ligaments also increases. So if we think of kind of staying in the middle lane, there really would be no reason to wrap double, and we'd be more inclined to just wrap the thighs. So that's really my advice to you as a practitioner when we want to think about coming into these postures in a way that promotes long-term health in the body, in folks who are going to be practicing regularly as a long-term part of their exercise plan. If I'm always taking every pose to the nth degree, you know, kind of working to those outer edges, I can put some strain on different parts of the body, which over time can wear and tear on particular parts of the body in not so wonderful ways. Does it guarantee that will happen? No. Does it increase the chance that it will? Yes. Does wrapping like this create any of those problems? No. So again, this is just, you know, my approach to teaching and presenting the practice is to keep that long-term goal in mind of using yoga as a tool to promote health in the musculature and joints and infrastructure of the body for the long term. So I think you kind of get that idea. And from this, you know, point, of course you can choose. Maybe every once in a while you do it. But anytime you kind of take that extra piece, think about how it shifts the proper alignment of the pose. So if in order to get there, you come off center, probably want to let that go. The hips are also flexed, right? So I'm not in hip extension and I'm not standing up tall. The pose is actually harder to do if I don't flex the hips a little bit. So you want to have a slight bend through the hip. So coming into the pose itself, I'll show you from the side, taking the arms up, taking the right arm underneath, right, hugging the forearms together, flexing through the hip, taking the right leg over. Now, in all balancing postures, because we're standing on one leg, we immediately have to call into play muscles on the outer hips to stabilize. And the big muscle that's an outer hip stabilizer is the glute medius. So not the glute maximus, which is our hip extender along with the hamstrings, but the glute medius, which is a little more anterior to that and more lateral. So it's a little more on the outer hip. And this also is part of this kind of lateral aspect of the hip from a muscular standpoint. So also we're talking about the tensor fascia lata and the IT band, which run down the outer thigh. And so as soon as I lift onto one leg, if I'm not engaging the outer hip muscles, I'm going to have some slump. Also, if I don't engage the core, I'm also going to have some slump. So here, if I pick up one leg, no outer hip, no core, something like this. If I start to engage the outer hip muscles, engage the rectus abdominis, you can see how I get steadier. And so things only get more challenging as I add more pieces. So this is why balancing poses can be so great muscularly in terms of strengthening the outer hips. And if we think about just in our day-to-day walking, and then when we start to add more complex motor movements like running, we're lifting one foot up, right? So we're starting to require some strength in those outer hip muscles to keep the pelvis from being a little bit wishy-washy and wiggly, and we also want to use a little bit of core. So that is going to be a piece of almost all the yoga poses, balancing-wise, that we do, regardless of the shape. So again, coming into the left side, I take my left arm under, I flex the hips slightly, keep the elbows about shoulder height, take the left leg over, hug in, draw in, belly button to core, and then I can find that stability. Okay, so that's your eagle pose. The next one is tree. So these are kind of opposing postures in terms of their anatomical position. So here, I'm internally rotating the hips. In tree, I'm externally rotating the hips. So in this case, the right side. The same idea applies. If I have no core involved and no outer hip involved, when I pull the foot up to the leg, it's going to be very slumpy. And you'll see that what students oftentimes do is they place the foot there and then they kind of sit in the joint. You can see how I'm sitting in the joint here rather than actively rooting down and pulling in and up to create stability. So if you think about going back to anatomical position, the pelvis is level, just like you see in the skeleton. And I want to maintain some of that even as I draw the foot up. So I have to add a little bit of, in yoga we call it Uddiyana Bandha, upward lifting lock. I have to root into the leg, let the right hip open, and not sit in the hip. So again, I'm recruiting those outer hip muscles, especially here, to hug in, and the whole thing gets integrity. Now, of course, it doesn't really matter where the foot is. There used to be a lot of cueing around, don't press your foot into the side of the knee. I mean, I think it does kind of naturally feel not so great there. So you're probably better off staying away from the joint itself. So that's your tree pose. The next posture is half moon. So this is a little different because it's a little more on the floor. I like to suggest that students use a block or maybe even 2 blocks for this. So let's kind of break this down from the bottom to the top because you know, when you think about balancing postures, if there's a lot of incongruence at the top of the pose, it's almost definitely because of what's happening at the ground. So it's helpful to teach balancing postures from the ground up. So here in Half Moon, which is a one arm, one leg balance with a twist, we want to first think about just that basic theme of stacking the joints. So stacking the shoulder over the wrist rather than being out here or someplace else. Stacking the hip over the heel, taking this leg back. Now, just like in eagle pose, where I was mentioning to engage the stretching of the palms and the fingers, this back leg has to be really engaged. Otherwise, if it's sleepy, the whole pose starts to fall. So it's really important here that this back leg, that the quadriceps is engaged, the leg is straight, and you're actively pressing through the heel. As you start, so it's got the external rotation quality just like your tree, to open this upper hip, make sure that bottom foot is straight. Okay, so now I am opening the hip, so I'm starting to contract the piriformis muscles, the gemelli muscles, right? So these are external rotators. That leg is very active, shoulder over wrist, and then taking the arm up to the sky, right? And you can play with the gaze point to add more challenge, and then come down. So, many times students will resist using the block. I'll just give you an idea of what it looks like without. So you can see here, my head is lower than my heart, so it becomes like a down dog inversion type quality. And so we really want to try to get people out of that habit of hunching and leaning and more into the habit of pressing away. And that's why the blocks help. Another shape is just one on the side, but you'll see my head is pretty much in line rather than letting my head be lower. Because once the head drops, the weight of the skull counteracts the weight of the pelvis to a certain extent and starts to drag us down. And this is something that we see in the next balance in crow pose. So crow calls on the serratus muscle, shoulder stabilizer, just like we used in our eagle, just like we use in low push-up, just like we use in dolphin, right? So we're not using trapezius. And so if I come down and make those low push-up arms versus straight or out, and I lift up and I get the elbows over the wrists, how can I just start to pull some of that into play? So the pushing down, just like in the other poses, the lifting the head slightly rather than letting it drop, the drawing the belly button in, those things together start to create lift. So a lot of these qualities in the standing balances will bring into the arm balance. One of the things that might be helpful is in my anatomy manual, I break down all the key poses. So for crow, I break down the pose. Every pose has the same breakdown: primary action, key muscles, joints, modifications, things to look for, and speaking to mind. So if you're a teacher, you can literally go down this list and pull out pieces you want to use as cues in your teaching. And this will give you a chance to start to study more the muscles in action in the poses so that you can become more familiar with the practical application of anatomy to practice. The other thing that you might enjoy is in the Structure and Spirit book, I break down crow pose from the perspective of the instruction I'm giving you here. So this starts to talk about the different aspects of not only the cues, but some of what goes on in the mindset of your students as they're approaching certainly a pose like crow. Many, many times in class, I think for as long as I've been teaching, I'll see people just sit out in crow. And it's always kind of a hard call because you never want to force somebody to do a pose. But I do feel like on some level, there are some postures that students just say in their heads, I can't do that. And so they just kind of sit there, right? And you never want to badger a student, and you never really know what's behind why they're avoiding a pose. But I do wonder, it's the same thing I wonder with how many times people take pigeon on the back versus doing traditional pigeon. The typical reason for taking an alternative would be if there's some kind of injury or physical challenge to coming into the pose in a particular way. Again, we're not trying to force anybody, but I do encourage you to look for different ways to explain a pose like crow to try to open up the possibility to as many students as possible to do the posture. Another option you can give people is, you might have tried this before, having them come up onto a block gives them some height, and the height will help them get the pelvis up and get a little more of the bend in the arms. I find one of the biggest challenges is people try to do the pose with straight arms, and it's really hard, so if they can get a little bend by having some height, that can help them find the balance. The other thing that I would say I don't do anymore is I don't ask people to jump back to low push-up from crow. I find that unless they have a really good amount of control, that can be a really floppy movement. And what's most at risk in that movement? Wrists and shoulders. So if you have people who are here and they don't have a lot of control and they push back, it can be a very, very floppy action. So many times, most of the time, I have them just come from crow to ragdoll, and that's it. So let's just wrap up here with a couple of reminders. For anybody that is watching this video, you are eligible for a discount on the anatomy manual. So the manual is $65, but for watching the video, you get the manual for $50. All you need to do is email me, Karen@barebonesyoga.com. Let me know you want the manual. The book on Amazon is $31.99, but as a viewer of the video, you get it for $26.99. And somebody that comments on the video will get a book for free, just like I mentioned at the beginning, the folks who won in the first couple of videos. So feel free to comment. Of course, I want to hear how you're feeling about the instruction that's being provided. And lastly, I had a question somebody emailed to me about my online classes, because all of these videos were really just breaking down each pose, and I'm kind of intentionally not pulling them together in a sequence because it would just take too long, and I want to really focus on the component parts that then become the practice. So to apply what you've learned to practice, I want you to go to the online classes page on my website and pick up a class. They're just $10. There's 3 sequences up there. The question that someone emailed me was, are they actual sequences or is it more of a breakdown? They're actual yoga sequences like you would get in a class, but with a lot more anatomical information than you would get in a typical yoga class. So it's all in this same style that I'm presenting you here. And that's one of the reasons why I want you to download at least one class, because I want you to have an opportunity to practice in this way and to apply the information in this way as I'm presenting it here from video to video to video. So that's the end of video number 5. Stay tuned for the next one, which I'll post in the next day or so. If you have any questions, just send me an email, Karen@barebonesyoga.com. Visit the website. You'll see lots of different things you can download. One of the more popular downloads is right on the home page, which is a sequencing template for yoga teachers. And as always, I hope to see you at the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and namaste.